Van Winkle Casad children, as we know. But the ninth branch represented here is actually from a nephew's branch, family. So Dr. Hendricks talked earlier about Thomas writing to Orla, one of his nephews, and saying, come out and join me. And Orla eventually did. Well, another nephew that Thomas recruited to the valley, and I'm sure they can tell the story far better than I can, but another nephew was Frank Burke, B-U-R-K-E. His mother was Carolyn, or Caroline, and so Frank Burke's descendants are here. There are several of them. Many of them still live here in the valley. And I'm hoping that one of them at least would share a quick story, if you have, about Frank or
For Esther?
Well,
Trish, Mallory,
Marianne?
Bert, Marianne,
we've got some stories.
Esther.
Yeah. Here comes Marianne.
Marianne's going to share a story. Marianne Wheeler, granddaughter of Frank. Do I have that right? I hope.
Yes.
Okay.
And great-granddaughter of Carolyn.
And great-granddaughter of Carolyn Casad Burke.
Somewhere in the house or barn, there's a picture of me sitting on, we called her Mamacita slab. And there's one candle on my cake. And that's close to when she died. That was the only picture that I remember seeing. But now my grandkids call me Mamacita. Because we heard a lot about Mamacita through the years. Having listened to all these families, my father was Charles Francis Burke. My mother was Mary McDaniel Burke. And they talked so often about all of these cousins, you people here. Because I don't remember the specifics about the Aladdin Club, but they danced a lot. And Patricia's going to tell a story, I think, about getting my mom and dad together.
Yeah.
That was kind of funny. She's got a lot of great stories. But the Mandels and the Bennetts and all these, it's part of my history, learning about you and how much fun you were. And
Still are.
yes. So it's been a real, it's been so fun listening to all these stories and knowing that my mom and dad were part of that. Mostly my dad, for starters. Took him a while to get Mama to marry him. But anyway, I'll give it over to Patricia.
How about Esther?
Esther too.
Esther, yeah.
Well, I wish I knew more, and it helps for and my aunt to speak before to get those stories out. But I wanted to mention that Frank, who is Carolyn's,
Son.
Yes, Carolyn's son, he died pretty early on. His only son, Francis, who was the junior of a lot of sisters, was 7 years old when Frank died. So Frank was married to Mamacita, who is Hannah.
Yes.
Yes.
He was Papacita and she was Mamacita.
Yes. And hearing about this passion makes me realize there's a connection. I see it now. Frank, his son, Francis, the only son after this long line of sisters, he was called El Griton. He's known as El Griton, and he became a rancher farmer here in the valley. And his son, my father, was also called El Griton, which means the yeller, right?
Well, while Patricia's coming up here, I'll have to tell you this story about the Burkes had one of their sisters was Helen Burke Wogman, who lived in Albuquerque, and she had a maid working for her, and somehow they got to talking about Las Cruces, and she had family there and everything. So after that, a few days or a week, when the maid came back, she said, you know, my brother worked on a farm for Francis Burke, and she said they secretly called him the Sparks. Now, how do you say that in Spanish? Is it El Chico? What? No, that means small. What's the word for sparks?
Chispa.
Chispa? So Aunt Helen laughed and said, yes, that's my brother.
Well, this has been a really great experience. I missed the one 23 years ago, the family reunion, and boy, my mother was so upset with me. So I'm here, Mama. I didn't plan on doing that. This is Caroline Casad. It's the only photograph I've ever seen, and today was the first day I saw it.
Wow, I've never seen that either.
And while Rick was talking, and there was a photograph of Thomas, I was looking at his photograph, you know, with the beard and all that. And then I looked down at her, and it's like, oh my God, they have the same eyes. That's the only thing that looked alike, but it was the same eyes. So, of course, we didn't know her. She was born, I guess in Ohio, I'm not real sure. What I know really comes from Rick's book, because I don't really know much about her. And we were sitting at the table here, and my brother and Bill were saying, oh, I think they spelled her name wrong. I think it's Carolyn, L-Y-N. And I thought, no. So I Googled her and found a photograph online from the Globe Cemetery in Arizona. And she's Mother Caroline C. Moore. And she died in 1917, I guess. Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting. We're kind of piecing things together during this reunion. I think Thomas talked Caroline into coming here to Mesilla, and she brought Frank, her son. Her husband, Ira, had passed away, so she brought Frank, and she was my great-great-grandmother. They settled in San Pablo, which is 3 miles south of Mesilla on Highway 28, and they started some apple orchards as well. And I remember my mother telling me stories that they would harvest the apples. This was at the turn of the century, late 1800s, 1900. They would harvest the apples and load them up on a wagon, and then Papacita, or Frank, would drive them to El Paso, and he would stop in Cañontillo and stay with the families there because they couldn't drive the horse, ride the horse all the way to El Paso. They had to stop and rest. And then he would go in to El Paso and be there for several weeks, and he missed his family so much. He would write letters, love letters, back to my great-grandmother, to Mamacita. And she would write to him, and he would just mail them to Mesilla Park, New Mexico. And in 1967, my grandmother died. She had saved all those letters, and my mother and I didn't know about it. So we went down to the basement and found this old trunk with cloth on it and stuff, and the arched back, and we opened it up, and it was absolutely full of love letters. And my mother and I started crying. We just sat there, we were reading letter after letter, and my dad is calling down in the basement, "What are you doing down there?" Oh, you wouldn't understand. So years later, we were able to hang on to those letters, and I still have some of them. And so I think we've decided we want to donate those. Yeah, which would be really good. But here's a little sidebar I hadn't planned to talk about. A few years ago, just before my mother passed away, my niece came to visit, And I think she and her husband had crossed ways a little bit, and she was not real happy about it. And so I produced some of these love letters, handwritten in pencil. And I said, I want you to read something. So I gave her a little pile of these letters. And my niece is not a woman to cry. She's a lawyer, and she's a defender, and she's tender as well. And she started reading these letters, and something changed in her, and she said, that's the way it should be. That's the way marriage should be. And I was so proud of her. So I think she went home and demanded more of her husband. And I think he became a better man because of it, to this day, right? And that was what, it's almost 17 years ago. Yeah, I think they really got it together. Another story that I remember, my grandfather wanted to date my grandmother. They were going to court, okay? They were courting, dating. And my grandfather was a poor man. He too was a lawyer, but he was a self-made man. And he wanted to take my grandmother out. They were, again, living in San Pablo, right down the street, right down the road from Mesilla. And all he had was a horse, and he couldn't very well put her on the horse and take her out on a date or anything. So he talked to Frank Burke, and Frank agreed to let him have the buggy. And so he was on his best behavior. He would put my grandmother in the buggy and take her down the river, and they would hang out, and that's where they did their courting. But he was always a gentleman because he knew everybody in the valley would recognize the rig, being the Burke's rig, and so he couldn't really do any, any hanky-panky, I guess. So I grew up knowing that story. Let's see, what else? Was there anything else?
The artesian well.
Oh, yes. We have a photograph somewhere in our family, I hope we still have it, of Frank Burke kneeling down by this solitary pipe coming up and out of the ground down at that apple orchard. And we think he had the first artesian well in the valley. He was the first one to actually irrigate from a well, which is interesting. So, and I now live just a few miles from where they were. I drive by it every day, and I think I was living in El Paso and needed to get back to New Mexico for some reason. I'm a native Texan, but but I had to get back to New Mexico, so I just live a few miles away from there, and it's really nice to be able to drive through there. I've been in the cemetery many times with my mother. I grew up going to the cemetery and seeing all the Casads, and I know all of your all's names. I just know all of your names. So it's going to be fun to go to the cemetery tomorrow. And then one more quick thing. When Frank died, he died in 1905 of pernicious anemia. And they buried him across the street from the Masonic cemetery. And I don't think they meant to do that, but they did. And then Mama Sita didn't die until 1940-something, 1941. And so when she died, they actually exhumed his body and buried him next to her the same day of the funeral. But I didn't know any of this, and I couldn't find them. I went searching for them. And I had to go see Judy Bennett. Is she still here? Judy Bennett. God bless Judy Bennett. I did this search all around the Mesilla Valley, going into Catholic cemeteries, and I didn't know that the Catholics were buried separately from the Protestants or the Presbyterians until I met a man who was the caregiver, and he said, the keeper of the cemetery, and he said, no, you're Anglo, you're a Juanita. This is not your cemetery. They're somewhere else. And it's like, I could never find them. So I went to Judy Bennett, who was still working at the Masonic Cemetery, and she helped me piece it together. We found some articles and then realized that Papa Seed had been buried